Trexler?
Helms.
It appears that you are in maybe a 1989 version of The Matrix. Can you get out? Do you need help? And are you okay with it?
I can actually get out. A nice gentleman offered me the option to get out in the series of 2 pills. And I actually chose the pill that keeps me here because there's a lot you could say about this old school Matrix. But I mean, look at me. I've got the corner office with the window views. I feel like why push my luck? I like how I have it here.
And honestly, most matrices, as I've heard, you don't actually know you're in them. And even when you do know you're in them, you can't really operationally change it. But right off to your left, I guess your right and my left, for those who are watching on YouTube, you've got all the MS Paint features. So if you're not feeling maybe the really amazing grays of your office, you could make them into a pleasant beige. So yeah. I think, which might be a little too avant-garde for your personality, Trex, but I think it's just good that you can literally be the architect of your own environment. And if that was the case, hey, maybe I would have stayed in the Matrix too. But sorry, Morpheus.
That's good life.
So here we are. We don't know if I'm in a simulation or just you're within in a simulation, or maybe you're within a simulation in a simulation. But we have some very real questions to answer, not simulated by any means, that are kind of all on a cool area of what I would describe as cutting edge or emerging research. Now, the thing about research, Trex, and you and I know this well, is that it moves slowly. It is definitely seeks to disconfirm hypotheses. It is not quite the kind of innovative Silicon Valley kind of perspective we have with Hollywood influencing us or what we see. But it's not to say that there aren't sometimes really cool things on the horizon which have meaningful impacts on really practical decisions. So there's 3 questions that we're going to address today that are kind of under that broad umbrella. One has to do with literally what would we do as far as our physical activity? How would we actually manipulate our nutrition while dieting? And what is the pragmatic reality with our understanding of the relationship between volume and hypertrophy, and what do we actually do with that? And these are all based upon soon to be pre-printed, soon to be published, currently in peer review or recently published studies, which I think is neat and fascinating. So whoever says science is boring, how dare you? And in this one instance, we can at least partially prove you wrong.
Absolutely. Yeah. I will say that it was a bit disillusioning when you get into research and then realize the slow and painfully mundane process of what appears to be a breakthrough, where it's like, back in the day, you'd see a paper in the headlines and say, whoa, this came out of left field. I'm sure someone had an epiphany about three months ago, and here we are. And it's like, no, someone's been like kicking that idea around and agonizing over it for like 6 years. They presented it at a conference 4 years ago and everyone called him a jerk. It works really slowly, but in this case, we are on the cutting edge.
That's right. And even the tools that we have in the modern era of open science to make science move faster are still laughably slow. I remember there was a paper that I published. You all may know it well. Recommendations for natural bodybuilding, training, and cardio for both cardiorespiratory and resistance training. It was the sister paper to evidence-based recommendations for nutrition and supplementation, which we put in the JISSN. A fun story. I submitted it to a journal. I won't say where. It did get rejected with some good reviewer comments.
Nature.
We addressed the reviewer comments. Yeah, of course, right? Yeah. Barely got rejected. And then we resubmitted to another journal. We got no confirmation that it was actually even admitted. We did not know it entered peer review. And 10 months passed, and I emailed them and said, hey, listen, I want to pull this, and I'm going to submit to another journal. And sorry, but I just don't know what's going on. And I tried to email them multiple times at the 6-month and 8-month mark, couldn't get any response, heard nothing, did not know if anything was received. And then literally was about to hit submit on the manuscript backend server of the third journal we're going to submit to, and popped up into my email, hey, here are your minor revisions for that article at the 11th month mark. So now with open science, we have the avant-garde, crazy process that is, rankling the feathers of many an old professor in the ivory tower of pre-printing studies. And believe it or not, that process cuts at least 3 to 4 months off the publication process, but probably still takes you 6 months to get something out there from when you first start collecting, or actually, no, finishing the study and analyzing data.
Yeah. This stuff takes time. It's you got to really be about it, because it's a grueling process. But luckily, we are about it, and this show is about it.
That's right. So let's get about it, and get into some of these questions. So I think the first one, we're not going to bury the lead. People love nutrition. People love protein. And this is one that I think both of us can talk about. I got a question. And this is directed to, it says Eric, but I'm pretty sure they're directing it at me based upon the context. Eric, it's been 10 years since your systematic review on protein while dieting.
I was in 8th grade when you published that, by the way.
Wow.
Yeah.
So was I. Yeah. Believe it or not, I'm very advanced. No, I wasn't. It was during my master's. So this is actually, they're referring to what was my literature review in my MPhil, my Master's of Philosophy, which was on protein, and which actually was submitted in 2012, pre-printed in 2013, and went to full press in 2014. I believe it was in the International Journal of Sports Nutrition and Exercise Metabolism, and this is probably the most cited paper when people discuss, maybe you should have a higher protein intake while dieting. So the question is, have your views changed on this topic? Is higher protein while dieting still recommended? So this is kind of cool. I'm glad someone asked this question, because if you don't know, and why would you? I think maybe we've hinted at it a little bit, but we're going to give a little more hinting. It's now actually in peer review. Myself, the good Dr. Trexler here in this call with me, and the recently crowned, no, you don't get a crown, but I think you should, Dr. Martin Ruffalo, who just completed his PhD specifically looking at training to failure, which both Dr. Trexler and I had the pleasure of contributing to and helping him with. We are all working on a meta-regression, potentially that would have been, but we'll explain why not, a meta-analysis as well, and we'll discuss the differences on this exact topic, updating the systematic review that I did without any type of formal meta-analysis or meta-regression, although I did report some quantitative data way back in 2014, 10 years ago on this topic. So, Eric, you want to start on this, or since it's addressed to me, should I start? What do you think?
I can set the foundation here and then kind of let you steer it in whatever direction you like, since it is your question after all. But yeah, so we wanted to, the next generation of scientists, the young folks, Martin and I, said, it's time to, if Helms hasn't retired yet, we should get him back involved and see if we can kind of add to this, because, Helms, when you first published that systematic review, we joke, but it really wasn't that long ago, but there was not a ton of literature to draw from because of the really specialized nature of the research question. And I think that's a good thing, to have a very narrowly defined research question when you're talking systematic reviews and meta-analyses. And sometimes there's just not enough literature to really, sink your teeth into it quantitatively. And so you just summarize the literature in a systematic way and you move on. But now there's a little bit more research available to address that question. So first step, and I'm going to say we and talk about things with a lot of, team-focused verbiage, but I think Helms, you'd probably agree, Martin carried a lot of weight on this project. We were in the trenches with him, but I don't want to overstate my contributions here, because Martin was, Martin pulled more than his fair share of the load, I would say. So we 100%. Collectively, we started out by saying, let's look at what's out there, what's new, right? So we included all the studies from your 2014 paper and then did a systematic search of the literature since then, using what we considered to be essentially similar search criteria, so that we were really tapping into the same population of studies. There might have been a couple little tweaks in terms of the ultra specifics of the search terminology, but we're really tapping into that same research question and the same overarching literature. So we were able to incorporate some new studies, bring those into the fold. And, initially we were thinking, hey, it'd be cool if we could do a couple things here. So Helms, in your paper, largely due to insufficient literature, your hands were kind of tied, and the only defensible option, the only defensible choice, was to do a more qualitative type systematic review. We're thinking, okay, we got more data here, and there's no question that we could do something more on par with like a meta-regression, where, we could, take the data from each of these intervention groups in these studies and really plot them out and see how body composition parameters were affected across this spectrum of different protein intakes. So we were really confident we'd have enough data to do that. What would be cool with this research question is to take an even finer, more granular look at the effect of protein. And the way to do that is by doing a more traditional meta-analysis where you are looking at the effect size kind of within each study, comparing a higher protein intervention group to a lower protein intervention group, right? So instead of just plotting out all treatment arms on this giant graph, you're calculating an effect size for each study or each comparison of groups. And the reason I say that's a little more nuanced, a little more refined, is because in that scenario, each effect size represents the impact of these differential protein allocations with people from the same population recruited doing the same training program. And that's a huge deal, right? Because if you think back, for example, the classic figure that's going to pop into everyone's head from the Morton 2018 paper, which you were on as a co-author, you think that's kind of that classic figure where we get the 1.6 to 2.2 grams of protein per kilogram body mass number. And each of those dots on the plot is, the change in fat-free mass in a treatment group from one of these studies that was included. But all these different treatment groups are doing different training programs, right? And so that analysis was totally justified in the context of the paper, but it's still, you would love to be able to have that much data where you can actually standardize the effect of the unique resistance training program being done. Of course, that would be preferable. So in this updated systematic review that we did with Martin, we, as expected, had plenty of data for a meta-regression, but did not have adequate data in our judgment, in our opinion, to justify the more typical approach to calculating, kind of a pooled effect size that would be more reminiscent of a typical meta-analysis. So what we did here, we call it a systematic review with meta-regression. And so I'm sure some statistical purists will say, well, it's still a meta-analysis because meta-regression is a subtype of meta-analysis. True, fine. But we wanted to kind of differentiate and distinguish the fact that we were able to do this meta-regression approach, but we were not, we didn't think it was appropriate to do a more traditional approach to calculating a singular pooled effect size. There just weren't enough studies that did high quality head-to-head comparisons meeting all the parameters of our research question where people had higher and lower protein doing the same training intervention. So that is kind of the approach that we took. The inclusion criteria, I should clarify here, just to say, just to identify exactly what we're looking at. We're looking for people that were healthy between the age of 18 and 50. And we were looking at folks that we considered lean. Now, that's not shredded, okay? So one of the interesting questions that we had to wrestle with as a team was, what's lean, all right? And really, I think what what we are trying to do here was differentiate. You've got this huge body of literature looking at weight loss in individuals with overweight and obesity.
Mm-hmm.
And of course you do, because that is the public health interest of weight loss studies is to prevent or reverse overweight or obesity. So it makes all the sense in the world that the majority of weight loss literature is done in those populations. But our research question was really, well, what happens when you have kind of a more fitness oriented type of population who is doing these weight loss diets for whatever reason they're doing it, right? It could be health oriented, but more often than not, it's physique oriented. Sport oriented, physique oriented, whatever you want to put in there, right? So we used, we kind of leaned on the literature in terms of identifying what justifiable body fat percentage cutoffs would be in our opinion. And we settled on about 27.8% for males and 39.7% for females. And I know some people are going to balk at that and say those numbers are too high. But I think there is a huge distortion in the fitness industry of how people view body fat percentage. If you were to ask a physician who's really up to date with the literature, at what percent body fat should I start to be concerned about my cardiometabolic health as a male? They're probably going to give you a top end number that it's not too far from what I said there, 27.8. And for a female, maybe in that 38, 39, 40 range. What's really interesting about fitness industry perspectives on body fat is that people think you need to be way lower than you do in order to be healthy. Simultaneously, people think their body fat's way lower than it is. So there's kind of this like double distortion effect going on where people will say like, well, I know that I'm not in the high risk category for cardiometabolic health because you need to have 14% body fat, and I do. And they're like double wrong because it's like, okay, here's the bad news. You don't have 14% body fat. You have 23% body fat. That's the bad news. The good news is that you're still within like a really good range in terms of what we associate with cardiometabolic health outcomes and biomarkers that indicate risk. So it's this like double wrong layer where people actually make the right decision in terms of whether or not they should be concerned about their weight. But it's because they are kind of making these dual, misperceptions about body fat percentage. So yeah, that is the approach that we took, Helms. And do you want to give a little overview of kind of unwrapping the Christmas presents or Hanukkah presents and seeing what we found?
Absolutely. Yeah, any type of holiday present I will unwrap. Yeah,
Yep.
So no, I really appreciate the background. My master's was specifically trying to answer the question of, does it make sense to have a higher protein intake for competitive bodybuilding? And the systematic review I looked at was, all right, well, what's going on in competitive bodybuilders when they are dieting? They are lean, they're physically active through cardio, they're also resistance training, and they are resistance trained. And there are mechanistic rationale for why that would potentially increase protein needs, both on the synthesis and the quote-unquote breakdown side, or the utilization metabolically of protein for fuel. And we do have mechanistic support of that. There is studies on muscle protein synthesis and breakdown that indicate once you go into a deficit, the quote-unquote cap on muscle protein synthetic responses to protein and training is a little bit reduced, which is probably the primary cause of why we don't see as much muscle gain in a deficit, as beautifully illustrated by Murphy's recent meta-regression, and also just shown that people tend to sometimes even lose muscle mass when resistance training in a deficit. But this seems to be modified by when you are leaner, because while that is all that's observed in people with obesity, when you look at people who are leaner, you also see an increase in muscle protein breakdown, which is often just a proxy for using more protein for fuel, which has been demonstrated for multiple decades, where we see lean people versus people with obesity using more leucine for fuel, having higher rates of gluconeogenesis, essentially converting protein into other substrates like ketones and glucose. And essentially, you could see a demand for higher protein on both sides of the equation, trying to offset that muscle protein breakdown and trying to overcome that cap on muscle protein synthesis. But again, at the time when I initially did this 2012, 2013 systematic review, the best I could do quantitatively was to simply look at studies where they measured these outcomes similarly to the inclusion criteria we have. Are these people lean enough? Are they training? Was the study long enough? And did they quantify protein and changes in lean mass? And the often misinterpretation from that systematic review was that I quote unquote proved that higher protein intakes were better during a deficit. But the reality is, from an epistemological perspective, is that all I could say was that in these 6 studies, that was all I could fit into my inclusion criteria at the time, the intake of 2.3 to 3.1 grams per kilogram of fat-free mass was associated with better fat-free mass retention. And the qualifier there was that, okay, when I looked at all these 6 different studies, the treatment groups where there was a non-significant loss of fat-free mass or no change, or actually a positive increase, significant or otherwise, in fat-free mass, that was the protein range in which that occurred. And that was what I reported. And I think people probably took that without understanding that limitation. And there's a really big difference between some study that gives you that information, but was asking a totally different experimental question, versus studies which are experimentally trying to control for training, control for everything, and the independent variable that's being manipulated is only protein intake. And again, like Trexler mentioned, that's why we didn't have a meta-analysis, because we didn't have enough of those studies. Back in the day, in my systematic review, there's only 2 studies which actually were true experimental comparisons of an independent variable being protein in those conditions. And I think we were up to 5 or 6 now, and we didn't feel comfortable with that. However, meta-regression gave us, hundreds of participants essentially. So we're kind of slowly climbing up this hierarchy of evidentiary quality. We've moved from just kind of reporting the associative range with where things went okay to, hey, we don't quite have a meta-analysis, but we can actually look at the relationship in all these studies, which a minority are actually experimentally looking at this, between fat-free mass retention or change and protein intake. And I think we're a lot more confident in our findings now, but there's still more work to be done because there is just not a lot of experimental work in this area. So now, unwrapping the gift, I will paint broad brushstrokes because this is still in peer review and we can only spoil the plot so much. But essentially, it did actually support the hypothesis that I originally had, which drove me to do that systematic review. There does seem to be a positive relationship between protein intake in a deficit and moving from even retention up to even fat-free mass gain, which I think was pretty cool. Some notable things. Another decision I made, actually spurred on by one of the peer reviewers, was to look at the relationship between fat-free mass and not just grams per kilogram of protein, but grams per kilogram of fat-free mass as a protein intake value, because that should theoretically be more sensitive in leaner individuals and be more specific to the retention of fat-free mass. And the relationship we saw was a little tighter when we quantified protein intake in that way. Not hugely meaningfully so, but it does seem to be a slightly better metric. And
I would also add, if I may,
yeah,
Helms,
please do.
The advantage there probably gets even greater in situations where you don't artificially exclude everyone with high body fat percentages. I would say that that's the population where I've always argued that going by fat-free mass is really advantageous on that side of the spectrum as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. And in sports science and sports nutrition, where you're often dealing with, athletes who are trying to optimize power to weight or strength to weight ratio, have to make a weight class cutoff. And it doesn't even necessarily need to be bodybuilders or powerlifters, but like rowers, where you want to weigh less because you're trying to propel yourself and your mass down some track or a causeway or whatever. This becomes important. And in those scenarios, you often do have sports dietitians that access to body composition, and even just your kind of ad hoc estimation of body composition is going to be more accurate because you're not dealing with a very large amount of adipose tissue. So yeah, I totally agree. So generally what we found was this linear relationship between protein intake and fat-free mass retention. But a huge limitation is that this is a meta-regression, not a meta-analysis. And, technically a statistical purist would say you can't make conclusions even based upon meta-analysis, but I don't agree with that. If you're doing a meta-analysis of a bunch of RCTs, I think it strengthens their findings. It's not truly an experimental, like maybe you can make the argument that a 10,000 person experimental trial is stronger causational findings than a 10,000 person meta-analysis, which, better controls, et cetera, et cetera. But I think this provides strong yet preliminary evidence that higher protein intakes are more beneficial when dieting, and in these conditions of being lean and doing resistance training. One thing that I suspect is not the case is that it is truly a linear relationship that goes on at just forever, where if you're at 5 grams per kilogram of protein, that's better than 4 or 3 or 2 in a stepwise fashion. I think to some degree, we just have to be aware that we can only do a meta-regression or a meta-analysis on the data that exists. So if we have only a few treatment groups that exist in the literature where there are these very high protein intakes, there's a lot of uncertainty around those higher protein intakes. So I won't give any quantitative specific numbers just because I think that's probably a little premature based upon that this is still in peer review. But essentially, the values are higher than what we would recommend in the state of maintenance or surplus, where, if we look at the Morton 2018 one or the more recent, say, one by Nunez, which I think came out just a couple of years ago. Yes, when they did the categorical analysis, 1.6 and higher produced the highest effect size for changes in fat-free mass and strength, but there was still a positive outcome when we were looking, I think, at 1.2 to 1.59. It's just a little bit better at 1.6, but after that, we start to see this plateauing effect. And I think there logically would also be a plateauing effect at a deficit, but if it is occurring, we haven't observed it yet, and it would probably occur at a later point. So I think if you're operating under the assumption of, hey, 1.6 to 2.2 grams per kilogram of protein is quote unquote optimal, I would probably recommend staying towards the top half of that, or potentially being comfortable going higher if you want in a state of a deficit. Just being aware that in a deficit, you're dealing with a more restrictive budget, if you will, because any increase in protein is going to require a decrease in fat and carbs to reach that calorie restricted state. And there is probably theoretically some point where you drive carbs and or fat too low to where it has a greater negative impact on the outcomes you care about, either athletic performance, health, or even potentially fat-free mass retention if you really start messing with things physiologically to where it isn't worth that increase in protein. But yeah, that's kind of the high-level findings. And it's not just that I don't want to talk about the quantitative findings. It's that I am aware that peer review could unearth some mistake that we potentially made. I think we did a pretty damn good job quantitatively on this. That is much more, Trexler and Ruffalo's realm. And I think we did a very good job on the inclusion criteria and interpretation. But, it is always possible that there is something we missed. So the numbers could change. I don't think the directionality will change or the overall findings. I'd be really surprised if that occurred. So that's why we're comfortable talking about it on the podcast. But essentially, to answer the question directly, have my views changed? Yes. I was much more speculative, I would say, related to the idea that higher protein would be better during a deficit previously. And I thought I was more of a better safe than sorry. And now I'm relatively convinced that it is a good idea to consume a higher protein intake while dieting, and that it will have a measurable impact on fat-free mass retention, but still with the caveat that you need to make sure it doesn't drive down other macronutrients or lead to the overall sustainability of the diet being negatively affected. So I think you do have to kind of consider the reality, logistics, and the person in front of you first when you're thinking about this from a recommendation standpoint. But from a quantitative physiological perspective, yeah, it probably makes sense to have a higher protein intake while dieting, especially if you're lean, especially if you're doing resistance training and your goal is to maximize fat-free mass retention. And there was one other sub-analysis we did, which I found pretty intriguing, which did indicate that relationship was strengthened when you look at body fat percentage as a covariate, so baseline body fat percentage. And that does speak directly to kind of the potential mechanism here, is that when you have more adipose tissue, you have an alternative metabolic fuel source than amino acids, which you're going to, scour from your own body in the state of a deficit. So the leaner you are, probably the more it makes sense that the protein intake should kind of compensate for that fact. So yeah. And the last thing I would say, Trex, is that the overall effect sizes here are small. And that's something that people need to remember, that is that the enthusiasm and the interest which we have in protein as a collective bodybuilding community or even fitness community is typically not matched by the actual quantitative magnitude of effects that we see for protein affecting all kinds of outcomes, from health to performance to body composition. The effect is there. It is 100% real. It is significant. The confidence intervals indicate it, and we have enough data to clearly show that to be the case. But often we're dealing exclusively in the realm of small effects, which I think is interesting. And I remember one of the things I did during my master's studies is I was just kind of collectively looking at all the data I could find on whether higher protein or lower protein had an impact on body composition. This is actually in the course of me arguing with Menno Henselmans in our debate back in the day. And something like in 80% of cases, there was no significant differences between higher or lower protein intakes at the time, 10 years ago, on body composition. And then in all but a single study, in those other 20% of cases, there was a positive effect leaning towards better fat-free mass retention or gain, depending upon the study design, with higher protein intakes. And there was that one single study, which I'm pretty sure was, a false negative or an error, I should say, indicating a lower protein intake had a positive impact on fat-free mass change. So, meaning that the difference between these protein intakes, especially over the short term on body composition, is very, very small to be typically not detected. But with a large enough signal to noise ratio, we can see that there is a small positive effect. But it's not going to be a game changer. If you were to go through a whole diet and get reasonably lean on 1.6 grams per kilogram of protein versus 2.2 grams per kilogram of protein, yes, if we chucked you into a DEXA, maybe we could pick up the difference in two alternate realities, but you might not even notice the difference in terms of the actual body composition outcomes. Is it the type of thing that a competitive bodybuilder would absolutely want to control for? 100%. Is it the type of thing that should be a big rock that every single person who goes to, say, a weight loss clinic should be concerned about? Absolutely not. And it should come after all the things that would potentially impact adherence, long-term behavior change, and positive health outcomes. But yeah, it's still real though.
Yeah, and I'm just relieved that we found what we found, because I know that if we found anything that refuted your pre-existing bias, you probably would have, metaphorically quit the game and taken your ball home with you. So I'm glad that we were able to confirm your biases with this analysis. That was a relief. It would have got ugly if not. One thing I do want to highlight, without getting too deep into the actual results here, is I love that you highlighted the magnitude of the effect.
All right.
That's a really important consideration. And another thing that's worth noting is, we were pretty surprised by the linearity of the effect. And I think you did a good job with the caveat that we can only calculate the slope within the range we observe. In most of these studies, protein is from around 1 gram per kilogram of total body mass to up around 2.5, 2.6-ish. That's where most of the data live. But within that range, it's not just, sometimes researchers will say, it was a linear effect. And what that means is they kind of squint and turn their head and say, oh, thank God it's linear. I don't have to do more complicated modeling. But in this case, we actually did pretty rigorous testing to make sure that the linear fit model was the most appropriate, best fit to the data. So it's not just that linear is defensible for the model fit. It actually was the best model fit compared to, other potential modeling approaches that incorporate nonlinearity. So yeah, I'm excited for this one to get out there. I think people are going to like it or hate it.
Yeah. It's one of those things where I know people have strong feelings about it, which is funny because we're arguing over sometimes. I remember the clickbait headline that Menno put out in his article back in the day, the myth of 1 gram per pound, and then what he recommends 0.83.
Yeah.
So I think it's one of those things where we are definitely arguing over the details, which may or may not matter outside of very specific, cases. But nonetheless, it's something that we nerds love. And for those of us who are going to be standing on stage in small underwear being judged while shredded, could make a difference. And that's my people. So,
Yep.
Anywho, I got another question, and we're going to kick it over to you here.
Yep.
How important is intensity for physical activity? I hear a lot of talk about different heart rate zones, and in other circles, I hear a lot of talk about step counts. Where do these intersect, and what should I be focused on? What's the deal?
Yeah, so this has been a focus of a few articles I've written recently in the old Mass Research Review. And one of the reasons that I covered it in back-to-back months was because the first time I covered it generated a lot of really good discussion, which is good, And so I said, okay, there's more meat on the bone here, more questions to answer, more clarity to provide. So I kind of hit it back-to-back months there. At least that's how I remember it. It was a couple months in close succession. But so first, the first paper that came out, it was looking at how should we be actually quantifying physical activity when we're trying to set goals for long-term health outcomes, so preventing morbidity, mortality, cardiovascular death, things of this nature. So back in volume 8, issue 7, I reviewed a paper by Hamaya and colleagues, which was called Time versus Step-Based Physical Activity Metrics for Health. And the purpose was to look at associations of step counts with all-cause mortality and cardiovascular disease, and then to also look at associations of moderate to vigorous physical activity time and all-cause mortality and cardiovascular disease. And essentially what they're getting at there is, should we be looking at just the total number of steps you accumulate, including the super low intensity ones? Is it really just a matter of getting activity volume in? Or does it really matter that you are meeting or exceeding specific intensity thresholds? Now, when we talk about intensity in this context, when we're talking about the more health-oriented literature and kind of physical activity monitoring, high intensity or vigorous intensity isn't probably not what you're thinking about as a fitness enthusiast. When we think high intensity cardio, we get a flashback to 2013 when everybody was doing repeated wind gates as cardio. That's not what we're talking about here. Moderate physical activity generally describes physical activity that puts you at 3 metabolic equivalents or above. And you're going to exceed that with not even that vigorous of a walk. It doesn't even have to be that brisk of a walk to exceed that. And then when we talk about, getting into the vigorous range, which is 6 METs or 6 metabolic equivalents, even a pretty leisurely jog is going to put you in the ballpark there. And in some cases, depending on the characteristics of your resistance training program, you may indeed be at that 6 or 7 range for METs when you're actually doing resistance training. But with that in mind, this paper was looking at data from the Women's Health Study, and it was a huge sample of almost 40,000 women, age 45 or older. And so they were looking at, the Women's Health Study has about 40,000. This analysis ended up with a little over 14,000. So basically, pretty straightforward. They're looking at these correlations between, how many steps you were accumulating and how much time you were spending doing moderate to physical activity, and seeing how these would impact outcomes in terms of all-cause mortality and the risk of developing cardiovascular disease during the observation window of this study. Now, essentially what they found in a very concise summary is that it kind of didn't matter. Generally speaking, being more active was good for preventing all-cause mortality and for lowering the risk of cardiovascular disease. But it really didn't matter which metric you were using. And so what that means is, if you were acquiring plenty of moderate to vigorous physical activity time, great. If you were just getting your step count high, great. But if intensity was a really critical mediator of this effect or moderator of this effect, if you specifically needed plenty of high intensity physical activity to really get the benefit of physical activity, then we would expect disproportionate effects. We would expect that the folks who get plenty of steps but very little moderate to physical activity time would not enjoy much of a protective benefit. And we would expect that people who specifically get plenty of moderate to vigorous physical activity would have that protective effect, even if maybe their step counts weren't all that high. But in this case, it looked like both of these were just serving as a rough proxy of get your physical activity however you want, whatever intensity works for you. And if you're maintaining high activity levels, that tends to bode well for long-term outcomes. So I wrote that article and talked about how, we often get this question of what's the right intensity for cardio, or in what scenarios does intensity matter? And so I would definitely not claim that intensity is irrelevant for cardio. It just really depends what outcome you're looking at. If you're just doing physical activity for the purpose of supporting general health and well-being, I would argue that you have extreme flexibility to get that physical activity in whatever combination of durations and intensities you enjoy, and modalities for that matter. So if you like to get in the kayak and paddle around at a leisurely pace, by all means, that's a heck of an afternoon. If you prefer to get on the bike and do really intense sprints for 11 minutes, that counts too. You have a lot of flexibility. Similarly, if your main goal is body composition, if you're doing cardio as part of a weight reduction program, there's a great meta-analysis by Steele and colleagues back a few years ago indicating with regards to fat loss or the increase in fat-free mass, low and high-intensity cardio tend to be pretty similar. Their effects on body composition do tend to be modest when used in isolation, but there's no clear advantage of high versus low. I also reviewed a study in Mass not too long ago that kind of debunked a bit of a myth that adherence rates are considerably higher for high-intensity interval training compared to low-intensity cardio programs. That is an assertion that has been popularized, but the evidence doesn't really bear it out very well. So if you're talking about which one should I choose to facilitate adherence or getting lean or general health and well-being, the evidence would say that it's really just up to you, whatever you're going to be able to do consistently, and preferably something that you would actually enjoy. Now, having said that, there are some scenarios where intensity does become more pertinent. If you are training for a sport and you are if you're doing cardio because you're trying to develop a physiological capacity or characteristic that carries over to your sport, you need to design your training program with that sport in mind, right? So if you are trying to become a professional soccer player and you barely get beyond a brisk walk in your training, that's not going to work very well. You need to make sure that you're incorporating some intensities that are actually indicative of your sport. Now, there may be times where you go higher, and it's not like every training session should perfectly mimic the running velocities and durations you do on the field, but you should have some, and frankly, you should have plenty. You need to make sure that you are training in a way that makes sense for the sport-specific adaptations that you're trying to induce. Another place where it could matter a little bit is if you are a physique athlete and you are preparing for competition. I would argue that it's not that you have to go one way or the other, but if you prefer high-intensity interval training and you're super lean and you're training like crazy with weights and your calorie intake is low and you're probably not sleeping well, it's probably not a good idea to be doing 6 sessions of HIIT per week. You're probably going to beat the crap out of yourself and feel way worse than you need to. And so for that reason, when people are prepping or in a similar physiological state for whatever reason, I normally say, hey, let's scale down any kind of high intensity interval training or sprint interval training, no more than 3, maybe 4 sessions per week. And if we need to do more than that for cardio, let's work in some lower intensity stuff to supplement that. Now, Helms, I thought it was a beautiful article. I thought it was, borderline poetry, the way it was written. But like I said, there was some pushback, some questions, all very, very good, very productive discussion. So I revisited the topic in Volume 8, Issue 9. So it wasn't back to back. There was one issue gap in the middle there, but it's so much fun that the months just kind of bleed together when you get to our age, Helms. But anyway, I revisited the topic because a lot of people were like, well, wait a minute. VO2 max tends to be a pretty good predictor of longevity. And I don't believe that you're going to be able to get a VO2 max of 78 with, a leisurely walking program. You're going to have to mix in some higher intensities. So make this make sense. How does this work? And there's a lot of follow-up questions along those lines. And so I reviewed a study by Mielke and colleagues that was looking at Australian women with a 21-year observation period, again, looking at the specific effects of physical activity, volume, frequency, and intensity, and how those associated with the risk of hypertension or obesity in a huge sample of over 20,000 Australian women. And once again, in this case, the volume of physical activity was the major predictor. Frequency had like no bearing on the results at a given level of volume. Obviously, if more frequency is helping you get more volume, great. But for a given level of volume, frequency basically didn't matter. And the effect of intensity was extremely, extremely modest. And so what they did was their measure of intensity here was of the physical activity you did, what percentage of it was, I think, fit into the moderate to vigorous category. So like, again, into that like 3 to 6 MET range. But if memory serves, I think that was the parameters they used for that high intensity number. Now, the reason I bring that up is, so it wasn't moderate to vigorous, it was just vigorous. So 6 METs. Yeah. So what percentage of your physical activity was vigorous, 6 METs or above? And basically what they found was you could argue that it was better to have at least 1% of your physical activity in the vigorous category. As long as you cleared that 1% threshold, it was probably a little bit, not much, but a little bit better than 0%. But from the range of 2% to 100%, there was really no consistent impact. And the reason I laugh is because, like, if you move, I don't want to paint with too broad a brush, but there's a pretty darn good likelihood that if you are a person who considers yourself into fitness, you're probably breaking 6 METs plenty throughout the week. Even if you're just late for a meeting, you might break it, Honestly, being on a campus power walking while carrying a backpack, you might break it. But certainly, at various points on a leg day, I bet you're breaking 6 METs.
Guaranteed.
Yeah. So all that is to say, like, this study again said, like, okay, try to get 5 minutes a week where you're really, pushing it. So once again, this kind of underscored the idea that if we're looking for general health outcomes, it really is just kind of about accumulating that volume. If you're just trying to get the lion's share of benefits of physical activity, I would say, 8 to 10,000 steps a day probably gets you there. If you prefer to look more at intensity-specific guidelines, 150 minutes a week of moderate physical activity, 75 minutes a week of vigorous physical activity, or a combination of the two. Those are kind of the standard government guidelines. Those are probably going to get you the lion's share of benefits based on the evidence. Now, I know some people, especially in the fitness world, are more optimizers. They say, not, what's going to get me most of the good stuff, but what amount is going to make me feel like I didn't leave any gains on the table here, or in this case, any cardiometabolic benefits on the table. And my best estimate looking at the literature would be, if you want to leave no doubt that you're basically maxing out the potential for benefit, maybe in the 15 to 20,000 step a day range. And for a lot of folks, even the 15 to 17,000 should be plenty. And then in terms of the other way of quantifying, maybe getting triple the guideline or up to 5 times the general guideline, which at that point is looking like a pretty serious endurance athlete. 5 times 150, that's a large number. That's a lot of time to spend. And of course, you're mixing in vigorous, so that knocks down the actual time commitment. But you get the idea. There's a pretty wide range in there where you could say, okay, we're probably doing about as good as we can here. But if you really want to be more on the optimization side of things, that's kind of what the literature seems to be telling us. Now,
real quick, Trex, I think it's just important to point out that a lot of people are mix and matching these two different kind of categories.
Mm-hmm.
Like when you look at the typical fitness optimizer, they're trying to hit a daily step count that is some amount, and they might be on oh man, I'm quite busy, I'm sedentary, I have a job that makes it challenging, I'm not in a walkable area, so I'm really struggling to get my 7,000 to 8,000 steps. But then on top of that, especially with Iron Culture listeners, they're probably lifting weights 2 to 6 times per week for probably an average of an hour per session. And I would just point out that if you're doing that, those weight training sessions, even if you include the rest periods, you can count the entire weight training session at least as moderate activity, and some of them probably as majority vigorous. Yeah. So even if you are someone who's barely clearing that 8,000 steps per day mark, and you're training, let's say, just twice per week for 60 minutes, which you could say is maybe half moderate, half vigorous, you're probably actually you are probably maxing things out even with just that.
Yeah. That's a great point. There probably is almost certainly an additive impact here. So that's one element to consider. Another element to consider is you can think of on a day-to-day basis, it's kind of great that you can use either method for quantifying your exercise for the day, right? So maybe you don't have time to get in the normal steps that you aim for. So you say, okay, well, instead of getting my step count today, I'm going to make sure that I get a good, 20 minutes of vigorous activity in. And, you can on a day-to-day basis fluctuate back and forth in terms of which goalpost you're aiming for. And just kind of trust that on a normal day, I get either this many steps or this much moderate activity or this much vigorous activity. So it provides a little more flexibility there. Now, the last thing I want to address here really briefly is getting back to that confusion. A lot of people are like, well, wait a minute. Don't tell me that intensity doesn't matter because VO2 max is predictive of mortality and morbidity and chronic disease. And there's no way that you're maxing out your VO2 max with a exclusively super low intensity program. I don't care if you're getting 15,000 steps a day. Now that's true. I'm not going to tell anyone that you are going to be up at a VO2 max of 79 with a walking program, right? You're going to have to tap into higher intensities to maximize your VO2 max. But a couple things I want people to keep in mind about that is probably the two most important factors to consider. First of all, VO2 max represents a heck of a lot more than the intensity of your training program. So if you look at the things that impact VO2 max, we're talking about age, sex, your ambulatory status, if you're able to walk around, muscle mass, body fat percentage, and a huge range of medical conditions that impact your musculoskeletal system or your cardiorespiratory system. There are a lot of people who cannot do rigorous or vigorous physical activity programs because of a pre-existing medical condition. So when we look at this relationship between VO2 max and indices of longevity or well-being, there are plenty of people whose low VO2 max is curtailing their lifespan and having a negative impact on their longevity or wellness. But there are also a lot of people who have a low VO2 max because they are unwell. And that's definitely a large part of that predictive relationship. It truly is bidirectional, and I think we have ample evidence to indicate that. Another thing worth keeping in mind is that the relationship between VO2 max and longevity or well-being, to the extent that we can. I should also mention that a huge percentage of VO2 max is heritable, meaning some people are just born with really high potential for a high VO2 max and others aren't. Just like some people grow like a weed when they touch a weight and others don't. But the other element I wanted to mention here is that there's likely an impact of magnitude in this relationship. And what I mean by that is, let's say we're talking about increasing your VO2 max by a level that climbs you up 20 percentiles, right? If you're climbing from the 5th percentile of VO2 max in the general population up to the 25th, I bet we are literally adding months, if not years, to your life. If you climb from the 75th to the 95th, I'm not so sure. Like, I think probably 75th puts you in a pretty good spot for me to say that a lack of cardiometabolic health at this stage in your life is not contributing to your imminent death, right? Like 75th percentile is pretty good for that purpose.
My bet, if that's road cycling, you're increasing your risk of all-cause mortality just because it's more time that you could get hit by a car.
Yeah. That's true, unfortunately. Yeah, cycling, especially on the road, is very, very dangerous. In America, cars don't know how to handle it. Yeah, definitely. So the question is not just, is VO2 max going up, but to what extent and in what range of that spectrum do I currently exist in? Because no one in their right mind is going to look at someone who is ranked 13th in the world as an endurance cyclist and say, you know what, purely by virtue of a higher VO2 max, I think they're going to live longer than the person who's ranked 113th. That's a big gap in terms of competitive placings. But at the end of the day, you're going to look at both of those people and say, yeah, lack of cardiovascular fitness is not getting them. Like that is not going to happen.
That's not the issue, right?
Yeah. So all that is to say, this is why we can look at total volume in aggregate of physical activity and get a pretty good proxy for how you're doing in terms of some of these health benefits. And only when you start getting into competitive endeavors or, trying to do your best with extremely limited time available, that's where intensity really starts to come into play.
Awesome. Now, you did a fantastic job covering that. And this final question that we have, also on volume, but on resistance training, I'm going to tackle, and I'm going to be probably the most brief on it out of all of them for two reasons. One, it's the hour of power. And we're coming down to the last, say, 10 minutes, because, an hour of power means 70 minutes here at Iron Culture. But two, probably more importantly, is that this isn't our own research, like the protein topic, which is in peer review. This is something that is even before that. It's a preprint. It's not preprinted yet. And also, neither myself nor Trexler are on this paper. I'm aware of it because many of my colleagues are on it, and it's by virtue of me being on Josh Pellin's PhD committee alongside Dr. Zerdos over at FAU, and also knowing some of the co-authors and having looked through some of the data. So it's not my place to really spoil the plot, but I am going to talk about it a little bit because it's going to come out and it's probably going to rock some people's world. So the question is, hey, I heard that even higher volumes than indicated in recent meta-analysis may be associated with more hypertrophy. Is this true? So I am not going to say anything that has not been repeated already by some other content producers in this area, notably discussed even briefly on the Data Driven Strength podcast, which is where Josh Pellin and Zach Robinson do a lot of great work, also along with Jake. And also Milo Wolf has discussed this a little bit on his YouTube channel. So this isn't new information. I'm not spoiling the plot, but I'm going to also provide a little bit of understanding and more depth of some of the limitations and context so that people don't run too wild with this information when it does come out. So for background, we have the 2017 Schoenfeld meta-analysis, which did a categorical comparison of all the different studies that were available at the time, looking at weekly sets per muscle group per week and the change in hypertrophy. And they found mostly significant, but some non-significant relationships indicating a diminished dose-response relationship as you move from 1 to 4 to 5 to 9 to 10 plus sets. So clear beneficial relationship, relatively linear, and depending upon the analysis they used, showing kind of this graded dose response. Then we had Bas Val in 2021, who did a systematic review with a meta-analysis. They did not compare the smallest dosing of volume to the moderate and higher one. They kind of said, okay, cool. Schoenfeld did 10 plus. We want to look at higher volume research that was available at the time. So we're going to compare 12 to 20 to 20 plus. And they found that for the quadriceps and the biceps, there was no significant difference between 20 plus and 12 to 20. Although if you actually look at those forest plots, it was a little right shifted, although still crossing zero towards the 20 plus. But for the triceps, 20 plus sets seem to be significantly better than 12 to 20. Big caveat upon all this data and both meta-analyses is that they're counting everything on a one-to-one basis, indirect and direct work. So a tricep pushdown or a chest press are both going to get counted for as a set for triceps. So when we say, hey man, you got to do more than 20 sets of triceps, that's not that crazy when you think about your typical bodybuilding program. That's every incline, decline, flat press, shoulder press, on top of all the direct tricep work you do. And all of a sudden now you're like, oh, hold on, actually I do 18 sets and I'm already close to where supposedly the average response is. So what is currently in process and getting soon pre-printed by Pelland and colleagues is a meta-regression very similar to Robinson's meta-regression on proximity to failure, the effect of RIR on hypertrophy. And from what I've heard and what has already been stated, I will point this out, is that there seems to be a positive relationship going all the way up to around like 30 sets per muscle group based upon this data. Now it is diminishing, meaning that the more sets you do, the less return on kind of gains you get. It's been described, and I'm not sure how accurate this is because I haven't looked at the specific data, that for doubling your volume, you're getting a 50% increase. So that means if you go from 10 to 20 sets, you're getting a 50% increase in hypertrophy. And going from, say, 20 to 40, you're probably starting to tap out what was observed and what is available to look at. But again, you're probably seeing another 50% increase. But again, from a smaller point. So it is absolutely something that is not a good financial investment. But if you're a psychotic bodybuilder like myself and you have the time and you can recover from it, it may be worthwhile. Now, an important caveat as well, and this also has been repeated, is that, or said previously, is that one of the ways they analyzed this was different and it had a better model fit than simply looking at direct and indirect sets, meaning they counted indirect work. So again, that example of a chest press counting for triceps as half a set, and that was actually a better model fit. So once again, these set volumes seem maybe a little more inflated than they actually are. So this is kind of good news. That means that the best way to count volume, which many people do in practice already, instead of counting, a chest press as 1-to-1, you would count that as 1/2 to 1, and then the tricep work you count directly. So this doesn't necessarily decrease the volume requirement, but at least it lines it up a little more with the way bodybuilders typically are thinking about volume. Another thing I'd point out, and this I don't think I've heard repeated or said previously, and I think it really does bear a brief discussion, is that most of these studies are 8 to 12 weeks long, and many of them, but not all, are not using what we would describe as ecologically valid hypertrophy protocols. A lot of the times they're using ultrasound to measure a specific region of muscle thickness, and therefore the training is biased towards that. So you will see what is often what I would describe as almost a specialization cycle being performed for a 2 to 3 month period at most. So if we really want to be truly evidence-based, the only conclusion we can make is that for a 2 to 3 month period, when primarily specializing on a given muscle group and doing a lot of volume for it, we do see a linear relationship, although diminishing, between hypertrophy and set volume. So interestingly, in some ways, we can say that some of the colloquial in the trenches approaches to higher volume training where we do specialization cycles and we go, oh, you know what, I'm going to really hammer my chest, triceps, and delts for the next 8 weeks and get up into that 30 set range and then put everything else on kind of quote unquote maintenance volume. That's actually what's relatively well represented by this meta-regression, or at least what it sounds like. So this meta-regression is not super in support of forever, always, at all times, doing 30 sets for all muscle groups. So we can't conclude that would be better than doing something that is more like a specialization cycle. And while I am not claiming that higher volumes produce injury, I will just say that higher volumes require more time of training, and that does mean that you have a higher exposure risk to injury because we count injuries and we have data on the number of injuries that occur in powerlifters, weightlifters, strongmen, Highland Games competitors, and bodybuilders. And they're quantified per 1,000 hours of training, how many injuries occur. So if you were going from 10 sets to 30 sets, you're probably going to have around 3 times the time spent training, which means that even if there's no increase in the rate of injury, you're going to experience an increase in the rate of injuries per unit of time. And that may or may not be worth it depending upon how long that potentially takes you out of training. So I think there are many caveats to be said here as far as application, but to raw answer the question of, is it true that there seems to be a relationship between even higher volumes than previously studied and hypertrophy? It does seem to be the case. This has not even been pre-printed yet. It has not been peer-reviewed. So, a bit of an asterisk there. And the limitations are that this is probably only in the context of the studies that have been done, 2 to 3 months, primarily focused on one muscle group, and counting volume that is indirect, at least as a half set, or in some cases as a full set. So be aware that the seemingly extremely high volumes that some of these studies are reporting may not be as high as they would be in practice in the typical way we think about them. So Trex, that's all I got to say on the topic. We're hitting that faux hour of power time limit. But anything else you want to add briefly before we close this one out?
No, I've said my piece, and I think you nailed it. I'll be interested to see that paper when it comes out, but until I do, I'll reserve judgment.
And that is why we appreciate you, that level of conservative but open-minded skepticism that is the classic Trex that we all love, appreciate, and benefit from. So, dear listener, thank you for tuning in to another episode of Iron Culture. This has been another hour of power of cutting-edge research. If you like Iron Culture, please leave a rating and review, and remember how high our standards are for reviews, not because we think we're amazing, but just because we're protecting my mental health. So leave that 5-star and make sure if you leave a review that it is glowingly positive and I cannot misinterpret it. And by the way, smash that like button if you're on YouTube. It really does help us out. And we will catch you in that next episode. Insert date here.